first just want to thank the organizers, INET, CG, George Soros, Rob Johnson, and this extraordinary audience. This is really, I think, something quite special. I'm going to talk a little bit about the world and then about economic research, but I have to pick up on Charles Kindleberger. I actually took his course when he was writing that book. It was a course in European economic history when I was a graduate student. Why did I take it? Because we had to. They required economic history back before they closed it at almost every department. And he was writing that book and he taught some of it, but I have to say none of us appreciated what was unfolding before us. We didn't even think it was research that he was doing because it wasn't terribly technical or mathematical, and so it didn't seem like something you'd want to pursue or jump on, which is a total lack of originality and insight on our part. But it certainly shows the sociology of graduate students to not recognize that. It really became, of course, hugely recognized later, but it wasn't a required reading in finance courses. You would read Efficient Markets, which I believe, by the way, made huge contributions, but you would also have wanted to read about the inefficient part that Kindleberger talked about. I briefly say that I completely agree that not only didn't people see the financial crisis, but I think fundamentally we understand that you can't foresee all these things. And that's not really what it's about. It's about designing a system that's robust. Now, some economists and policymakers can certainly be criticized for telling us the system was robust when it wasn't. I want to talk about a fairly narrow issue, but bring it out into the theme, which is debt. We live in a world where there's a lot more debt than is in our models. In our models, you wouldn't have this quantity, this vast quantity of simple, non-indexed debt that we see. Financing would be much more complex and diversified. Homeowners would borrow in a way that was at least linked to house prices in some way, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's the famous Arrow-Debreu model that lays this out in great elegance. And I've worked on this a lot of my life, and the past 10 years, I've worked with the brilliant Carmen Reinhardt, who's also speaking later. And one of the points we emphasize in our recent work is there's still a massive debt overhang in the world, in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, and in many other places. Now, having worked on models of this, it's amazing how primitive our political economy is in analyzing this. It's not that it's not recognized that there's political economy, but it's very, very difficult to integrate. Let me tell you this. I feel like I know all the models that there are, and there aren't any where when the government's running into budget troubles, it shuts down for a while. That's, I'm going to have to add that in, somewhere as to one of the variations. But it's fundamentally a political economy problem, and it is very difficult to integrate. Who is bankrupt? Well, governments really aren't bankrupt. They don't pay because they don't feel like paying, or their system can't bring it together. How do you model that? What are the limits? How does it depend on the politics? How does it depend on the history? How does it depend on the system? It's something that I think is very, very challenging. I do think it's useful, very, very useful, to look at historical examples, as Professor Reinhardt and I have done, and certainly Charles Kindleberger did, to try to see where the benchmarks are. But still, we'd like to understand it better. I do think that if we're a few hundred years from now, assuming we managed to get it together to make it a few hundred years from now, I really do sincerely believe we will have made a lot of improvements in these things. For example, the complexity of our tax systems, the way we do old age pension funds, which are Ponzi schemes that would make Bernie Madoff blush. And I do think some of these things will be changed. I don't think we'll live in a world without financial crises. I think there'll be problems, but I do think there'll be advances, just as as Harold James said, we did not have a second Great Depression. And I don't credit it all to China. They did a good job. But I think also our policymakers in the rich countries, I don't agree with everything they did. But we didn't have a second Great Depression, and we could have had a second Great Depression. And I do think economic thought influenced that reaction, gave them confidence in doing some rather bold things that they might not have done otherwise. So it wasn't all malign, the influence of economics, although certainly economists made these important mistakes. So going forward, we could go around the world and look at these debt problems, which are really profound, where government debts relative to income are in many advanced countries at all times highs, and private debts are just off the charts. And yet, in getting a deeper understanding of this, it is a political economy problem. These are not mind you, I think we will see defaults in Europe. I think we will see sovereign debt problems. But it's not because these are insurmountable problems. That's just absolutely not the case. But I have to say, I found it laughable when I listened to a European official state today that with the bailout of Portugal, that's the end of the crisis. I mean, I don't know what to say, but they're very complicated political economy problems. And then picking up on another comment on inequality, we certainly live in an age of profound inequality that makes, I think, it more unpredictable what's going to happen of how this political economy, which we could sometimes have in the background, but maybe will be less so. We saw the Arab Spring's an extreme example of that, but China's Gini coefficients are moving up and up towards the top, and the United States is very high. Brazil's a growing economy, it's very, very high. I do think that these pose rich problems, but if you look at what's taught in economics, there is a political economy branch, but it's sort of a footnote to when people study fiscal policy and how it works, and it would be nice to find a way to integrate it better. Let me just say a little bit about the research and the discipline. I feel a little bit like I have to be the defender of orthodoxy here, given that everyone's so critical about it. I mean, I think things like rational expectations, if we hadn't invented it, we would certainly want to. You can decide if you think it should be an economic science. It's certainly an economic discipline. And rational expectations and some of these more technical models bring fantastic discipline. And when I hear people who haven't that discipline speak about some of these issues, they may get some things right. They have a lot to contribute, but I also think having the discipline is very helpful across a broad range of problems. Now, debt, which is my theme, is an area where the discipline's not so helpful because the political economy is very important. A lot of the efficient markets literature is about the stock market. Well, that's well under half of global financing, way under half of global financing. A lot of it's debt. And the trouble is, in the Arrow-Debreu model, if you don't honor your contract, you get hung. That's what's in the background. You just get executed immediately so that you'd basically never consider doing that. But of course, debt doesn't work like that in our modern societies. When you don't pay your debt, well, that's the start of a conversation. And that's really what creates a lot of these inefficiencies and a lot of these crises. That's something I think we need to explore further. And I do think in terms of moving forward and say moving away from this world, which is so fragile, orthodox economics does have ideas. And for example, I'll list Robert Shiller as someone who's proposed having more innovative markets, having more indexation, being less dependent on plain vanilla debt. It's one of those things where I think he's far ahead of where the governments are, and they need to make a lot of policy changes, a lot of changes, before we really have the foundations for implementing these policies. But if we move forward to a more robust future, I do think there are ideas. Let me just close with, again, coming back to my book, This Time is Different, with Carmen Reinhardt. We worked on that for 7 years, and it's quite different than things I've done mostly in the past, and certainly different from conventional research that you see in economics departments and being quite fact-oriented and looking at experience. I had one of our top couple graduate students at Harvard come up to me, we were having coffee a few months ago, and said, oh, that's fantastic, it was so interesting, but Professor Rogoff, now that you finished this book, are you going to go back to doing research? Anyway, thank you.